Hello, this is Neo, just an average CSGO player, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
It doesn't matter if NEO and TaZ, legendary, iconic players of Counter-Strike, famously from Poland, like each other in any meaningful sense. What brought this topic up was a clip surfaced from, I think it was Snacks, obviously their longtime teammate in CSGO and arguably the best player in their team, streaming, and he made some sort of a comment about like NEO and TaZ like hating each other or not liking each other or something. And this understandably is quite shocking to casual fans or Western fans. I mean, listen, the players have been a duo for the better part of 15 years. Obviously, they're even playing together in theory now again at a lower level, but I'm talking about a tier 1 international competition. They stayed together even with roster moves in 1.6 and CSGO, even though admittedly they didn't do many of them most famously. They had enormous success together, unbelievable amount of championships, amazing comebacks, great wins, victories over the best teams to ever play the game. They've even obviously in interviews described each other not so much as friends, but as brothers even. Like, so it's like family, like it's a bond tighter than just teammates, etc. So this sort of a topic, a statement, brings up topics like if teammates need to be friends, or what could drive teammates apart who had so much success, or how should a team function? Like, what is the appropriate relationship people would have? Now, this isn't going to be a video, people might be trying to predict this, about like creative tension, about how sometimes having players who have tension or have different opinions can... I've already done that video. It's actually, I did one basically about creative tension in teams. I didn't particularly use those as an example, but it would be a classic one. That's not what this video is about. This video is about the fact that it's totally normal and reasonable that this scenario is how things might be, if indeed it is. I'll just tell you from behind the scenes, from knowing those guys a few years, seeing them behind the scenes, seeing them in their ups and their downs, I could certainly believe that certain things annoy them about each other, or there's been times when things have been going bad where maybe they had a contentious relationship. I think of some of the players in the team, they've also been able to overcome that in a way that some of the others actually weren't as mature as to be able to do and understand that they need to stick together, kind of Kobe and Shaq style, but not that extreme in terms of the personal relationship. But the key thing I want to make here is, the key point I want to start with rather, is that also is just the nature of their team and the culture that they created or maybe even come from within their country and team. Like, their team was very, very famous, in fact notorious in CS 1.6 for people behind the scenes for being very blunt and harsh in their way of problem solving. Essentially, by the way, even saying problem solving actually dresses it up more than I think they necessarily knew what they were doing. They would just argue if things went wrong. Sometimes, as I've pointed out in the past, they would physically fight. Now listen, that wasn't happening all the time. That's not overblowing it, Sarah, but that's extremely rare. That would get you kicked. You'd never play with a guy again if you were in a Swedish or a Danish team or something. And there's a classic video, people might have seen, that I actually recorded. Obviously don't get any credit for it, unfortunately, because that's where YouTube used to work back then with fuckers, where it was when they were playing under the name Again, because they'd lost their organisation and sponsors. I think it's when they'd been in Vitriolic and they hadn't been paid or something. And they're playing at the World Esports Masters, WM, in, I think it was Guangzhou, China. And they were playing as Fnatic in the semi-finals. Obviously they're big rivals. Slightly different rosters for both of them. They'd played in the WCG final like a month or two earlier. And in this particular scenario, on a stage match, you can see during this pod, if you go and look at the translation for what they're saying, it is outrageous, the stuff that they're saying to each other. So that was understood to be the way that that team functioned. And the key thing is, functioned. Like, they would somehow get through problems in that particular sense. I know that actually a Veggie from Roccat told me that that's how the League of Legends team kind of understood things. That was how the Polish team was in League of Legends. They took those guys as role models and thought, this is how we do things. This is how we do it in Poland. We're not just going to like pussyfoot around things or be like passive aggressive. We're just going to tell a guy that he's fucking up or he shouldn't have done that or play differently around me, etc. So that ties in with another aspect that people don't know about this team. Listen, they were very legendary for having to do extremely few roster changes in both 1.6 and CSGO. So that might naively make people think, oh, they were just such good friends. They never thought about changing players or upgrading. Did they? Fuck. Are you out your mind that they didn't? They did. What happened was, they just would find again, they wouldn't just passive aggressive. The difference is in certain Swedish and Finnish teams and even American, sometimes they would just cut a guy and he would just get told by the manager, like, what, I'm cut? And there would be no argument, no discussion. You're just cut because of bad play or they don't like you as a person or you had an argument. The difference in the Polish scene was, at least again, they would go head on. So what actually would happen in 1.6 and even in CSGO is, they would just threaten to kick each other behind the scenes. Or a couple of them would go, maybe we'll kick him. But then they'd change their mind. Something would happen. The guy would come around or they'd get on the right page again. So sometimes, like in 1.6, there was like a week or a weekend where someone was kicked. Like I heard like Lord was kicked at one point in time, Cuban. I mean, if people don't know, Cuban actually was kicked like directly, officially at one point in time, 1.6 for a few months. They had a guy called Pionas in, and they just didn't have very good results, unfortunately. Not necessarily his fault entirely. Look who was trying to replace. Eventually, obviously, Luke from the original Golden Five was kicked. And by the way, they kicked him at the end of the same year where a month or two before, they'd won the major WCG over what everyone thought was going to be the best team in history, Fnatic 2009 at the time, in epic fashion. And earlier in the year, they finished second in a major to the same team. So the idea that like success is what would make you keep together, that wasn't necessarily what they were thinking about in that team. In fact, even that legendary thing they said in CSGO, which I thought was baller as fuck, where they were sort of like, we don't change players, we change roles. Which, listen, is true, it's what they did. But I tell you what, that wasn't necessarily democratic each time, or maybe even any time. Like, I know in 1.6 there was times when they thought like Lord was overstepping his bounds. He was trying to like play a different role, or he wanted to be a star or a fragger or something, even though he was actually one of the best support players in the world. That would be like Zipnik's going to fucking Div P and going, you take a go at you as a support mate. I think I'm just going to take your role. Like, that'd be ridiculous. TaZ obviously is the in-game leader. He wanted to be in-game leader a lot of the time. But when they would go through their slumps, one of the things they would try would be giving in-game leadership to Neo or Cuban or someone else. Obviously Cuban more in 1.6. And then you have to decide for yourself who was the better idea. But did he necessarily want to do that? I mean, he had the tenure to put his foot down, but that's just the way it went in that team. And as I say, apparently that was similar to how the other Polish teams in the region and perhaps culturally in esports have been, from the little I know and the people I know within the scene. So, more importantly, and this is the central point that I want people to consider here, because it's going to apply to way more than just CS, esports. It's going to apply to like sports, music, life, quite frankly, if you think about it. If you consider the circumstances that NEO and TaZ played together under, it's almost to be expected eventually it would end somewhat acrimoniously, or maybe you stay together just for the business reasons. But, you know, as people, it's the equivalent of when you're the big band. I heard like U2 did this in like the 2010s or something. Like they would do concerts and it's like they would just arrive in 5 separate cars, go, have their own dressing rooms, go on stage. Then that's when they'd meet, they'd play the gig, and then they'd just go separately, private cars, the chauffeur, and they'd drive back to the hotel, and they weren't friends. That was the point. It was a business relationship at that point in time. So think about it. These guys played together for 15 years, and like of the 15 years, I'm going to say like 13 were at tier 1, competing against the best in the world and staying together on that crazy like world tour aspect that the CSGO open circuits always had, which produces beautiful tournaments and storylines, but is very... It's really harsh on the players. And if people don't know, some of the guys in 1.6, they would even, when other teams were all flying to the events, they would be taking like trains across all of bloody Europe to go to France and stuff like that. It was outrageous, like how much harder it was for those guys, because they never really, except for the time in Meet Your Makers, had really good backing and the biggest dogs in the world wanting to be involved with them. So I don't blame anyone if you played together for 13, 15 years, just saying, you know what, I think we've had enough time together, I want to go elsewhere. So that might seem counterintuitive to fans, because they think, no, but the fact that you played together for 15 years, that's why you'd never break up, you'd never dislike that guy. Have you never heard the very famous English saying, proverb, whatever, familiarity breeds contempt? What happens is when you're around someone a lot, especially all the time, and in Counter-Strike, because you're traveling all the time, it's like the guy's just there most of the time, except when you go home and you have some time apart, you start to notice every little minor flaw, every little tiny thing that irritates you about that guy. And because you've already got the good and the positive all the time as well, you've been with them for years, you start to take that for granted. And it's just the small things that get on your nerves, that drive you mad, that sort of, it's the equivalent of like the dripping hole in the roof into a pot. Like, that's not like as bad as like the whole roof just coming in and all getting all water everywhere and having to pour a plumb out. But that'll drive you mad if you just hear like tip, 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 and you're trying to sleep. So you go mental. So this is one of the reasons I've always pointed out to the guys in League of Legends. When in the early days of LCS, they used to have all these teams that were in team houses because they wanted to create content and save money on housing the team, etc. They would just be like trapped in together. And I would always say that's going to accelerate that principle. And that's why people would get cut after a split, after a year. Even sometimes when they were good players, they seemed like they fit in the server. They just couldn't get along as people, or they had the big blow up moment where they had to go and make a new team, essentially. So what other CSGO players, which other, have played for 15 years together, 13 years together at the top? The answer is none, by the way. I mean, Get Right and Forrester are a pretty legendary duo, right? And they lasted 11 years or so. Largely, by the way, in my opinion, first of all, actually, because Swedes to some degree a little bit more passive, and they already pick people as if it works in a social environment, whereas the Poles, like NEO and TaZ, used to be enemies. They were battling each other, and they were like, let's join forces, like some 80s fucking movie with like two movie film star action stars joining forces for some sick blockbuster movie. Like NEO and with your Get Right and Forrest, I actually think that was largely due to the role Get Right played in Forrest's career success, because basically Forrest was one of the best players ever for the first 2 or 3, 4 years of being a top pro, especially once he was in Fnatic. But he started to have moments where he had motivation waning and his form would fall and he wasn't necessarily the best, or famously he actually wasn't that good in major finals. He was okay in them, he wasn't like terrible or anything, but he actually lost tons of major finals. I'll go into that in a separate video one day. But basically, Get Right coming along, it was like, okay, this guy can do the heavy lifting for me now. This guy can help me stay at the top and can help me win championships. Remember, Get Right playing with Forrest won Forrest his second and third 1.6 majors. He only won 3. And then in CSGO, his only CSGO major. Like, you look at those tournaments, yeah, it was essential to play with Get Right. So I understand why Forrest even probably kept Get Right around at the end when it was Get Right that was having issues with his form and wasn't that good anymore, but probably did it because he was like, think about what this guy did for my career. Yeah, I'll give him as many chances as possible. If anything, these guys, NEO and TaZ, hung on the longest and had the most successful marriage of any players. Remember, of that golden 5, that won, depending on your opinion, like 5 or 4 majors together, which is incredible, by the way. That's more than like Card and Forrest and all those guys won in 1.6. Well, Luke didn't make it. I mean, he didn't even make it more than like, 3 or 4 years in terms of like the 5-man lineup. Cuban and Lord got cut early on in CSGO because they just couldn't make it in the game and they were holding the team back. And obviously, NEO and TaZ couldn't be the stars necessarily anymore. So the issue here is, in my opinion, this is not really much to do with NEO and TaZ. I mean, I've made this video like that initially so you can understand that. I'm now making some behind-the-scenes information and characterise who they are as competitors and teammates, etc. But this is really more about how fans reacted to NEO and TaZ and to this particular news. This actually reminds me of this incessant desire and drive of fans of famous bands to see the band reunite for like one last tour or do another album together. Even if they like, haven't been together for 10 years, 20 years, even if from interviews and biographies and stuff, they apparently, members hate each other or one stole money from the other one or fucked the other one in court or fucked his girl or in any way, number of ways screwed them over or worked with the manager to nick the money, whatever it might be. Like, they still want those bands to get together, but that's because that's the key point. Listen to the way I said that. They want that band to get together. Those band members maybe never showed any inclination to. Maybe those band members don't want to get together. So it's essentially the desires of the fans who aren't the ones there every day in practice or on stage or having to see those relationships. They just get to enjoy the beautiful music and the gigs and this cool aspect of two people they like separately being together. And maybe it's even some K-pop fucking angle of like standing them like, oh, I love that. They should have that relationship. Like, seems to be what people do on the internet now. That's basically what I see this as sort of a microcosm version of in esports. I mean, the worst example of that in music right now, by the way, is if you're a big fan or you really enjoyed the music of Oasis, one of the best 90s bands of all time, their fans never shut the fuck up about how they have to reunite. They talk mad shit on Noel Gallagher because they perceive he's the one who won't let them reunite, etc. Say his music's all shit because it's not Oasis. Even though, as they're explaining it, what they explain is like, sorry Noel Gallagher, you're only allowed to make Oasis and anything else you make shit, and also you have to play with your brother because I want you to. It's like, it's actually a bit infantile. Like, I don't think all of that's the same in CSGO. I think people are just a bit naive and they don't know the circumstances, or they've just never been in a top competitive relationship or team like that performed under a lot of pressure. But yeah, listen, think about the example of Oasis I'm giving there. Because it's a similar scenario, right? Remember that NEO and TaZ described each other as brothers. Well, you know what? In the case of Oasis, it's enough that you were already in a band, a massive band, doing world tours and stadiums and tons of albums. You're in a band with your brother, your younger brother, who, by the way, could definitely be super annoying, it would seem. Definitely a very, like, at times, if he wants to be offensive guy. For 14 years. I think you've done your hard yards there. I don't think you need more innings at that point in time. You don't have to play with him forever. You don't have to be around him forever. It's already amazing you were in a band with your brother for 14 years. Like, this is where fans seem like what they're doing is their great memories of the band, or maybe great memories and moments in their life which they associate with the music of the band and the influence it had. they're remembering that and they're trying to recapture or tap into that golden moment in the past. And they want to bring it to now and relive it or live a new version of it. It's like when people say about bands like, I used to like them for the first albums, but the other albums are shit. It's like, I get that. But in that scenario, I just stop listening and go to another band. Like, I've actually thought there's certain bands, I mean, I could give you a couple of examples like Limp Bizkit, Disturbed. They do make like all their albums. Like, if you like their first album, you're almost certainly going to like all the albums. Like maybe a classic example is the Ramones, right? I mean, famously, they used about like 5 chords to do like 100 songs or something. Like, those are bands where if you just like at the beginning, it's like you just like that shit. It's like reading Peanuts in the newspaper, right? Yeah, you want it to be the same all the time. I get that. There's certain bands like that. But if you want to really see these musicians like explore their full creative potential, express that creativity, some of it's going to involve maybe not doing that. Like, think about this. Think about what the musicians might want out of their lives after being fabulously successful, just like in CSGO, NEO and TaZ were fabulously successful. Musicians eventually are going to want to try to do some solo stuff. Like, I want to do a different genre maybe, or I want to play with other people. Maybe I want to play some God tier session musician that isn't my brother or this guy that I grew up in high school with who's playing guitar. Maybe I want to go play with Tony Levin for the bass, or if he was alive still, Alan Holdsworth on the guitar. So maybe I'm dating myself there because they're the people I think are gods of those positions. So even if those musicians loved that band, maybe it had its time. Or maybe it was of a time, or a certain impulse, or a certain influence, or a certain cultural milieu, and that just can't be recreated. And so they want to do something new, or something of this moment, or something of this cultural influence and milieu, and they don't want to stay stuck. This is why I think it's infantile. Stay like stuck in that like arrested development state of never being able to go beyond that, whether you like it or not. Like, I don't like some of the music some bands that have split up have done. I mean, a classic example to me would be like Led Zeppelin. Together, they were unbelievable. Every member, all 4 were unbelievable. But when you split them apart, like, I couldn't give a fuck about the solo stuff of like Jimmy Page. And, I mean, who cares? Like, I can just go back to Led Zeppelin if I want to listen to Led Zeppelin. I don't have to listen to Robert Plant or Jimmy Page solo stuff and go, why is it more like Led Zeppelin? Or why did you get back together? You're like, who gives a fuck? Like, let those guys live. You've already got the music. You can go back and listen to that anytime. If you want to go and experience NEO and TaZ at their top of CSGO, playing together brilliantly. You've got so many classic videos on YouTube, so many demos if you know how to work a CS 1.6 client. You can enjoy those for hours and hours and hours. You probably haven't even seen them all. Like, if you're a CSGO fan, there's some great CS 1.6 matches for you to jump into. I hope one day, by the way, I can actually be involved, if I get into a position to do this, with some of those channels that put up the old demos, of actually getting like classic matches and properly editing them so they're not just like a nightmare of just like directly go, that we can actually like showcase some of those great matches as a VOD, because they weren't VODs back then. You had to have the demo, you had to have the client. Obviously modern day people don't, so they can't go explore that. Because I've always hated how in the NHL, NBA, NFL, like until very recently, loads of those videos were either lost or they were just in some archive, and you had to hope that like ESPN classic films or something just played like a game randomly one day, and even then usually truncated it and took out some of the aspects you wanted to see. So NEO and TaZ, let's just be real, NEO and TaZ already accomplished more than enough. Far more than they could ever have dreamed of when they started out together. When they were just young Polish players battling in, by the way, a totally irrelevant scene of the Polish Counter-Strike scene on an international level. Then, what were they even fighting against each other for? They were literally just battling each other to see who would get the World Cyber Games spot from Poland, go to the finals, just losing the group stage, and nobody internationally even give a fuck. Poland, who gives a fuck? Like, let's go look at Sweden and Denmark and USA, and maybe at that time Russia was coming up. Like, no one gave a fuck. Like, they weren't battling for anything. So to think that they went on to win 6 majors, 7 by some people's counts. By the way, I know it's on Wikipedia. I've had my influence there. In 1.6, 6 majors. By the way, that's the most, or tied for the most, depending on how you count all the majors. That's incredible. Like, they weren't supposed to come from Poland and accomplish more than the NEO, Forest, all the gods of like Nordic Counter-Strike that dominated the game, especially for the first few years. In CSGO, they won a major. That's already incredible enough. And quite frankly, came pretty close to winning 2 majors. And I think if you look at how many times they were in the semis and they were a good team and gave a good fight to the team that won, their upper limit was probably 3 to 4 majors in CSGO. Like, they could have been even more legendary. I'll even say, by the way, as a side topic, maybe this is a topic for another video one day, if I contrast how they had their success in 1.6 and CSGO and characterize when they were favourites, when they were underdogs, how the matches went. That might even be one of the reasons why I still in my heart think CS 1.6 was better, because I believe it was more about team play and cerebral play and positioning as opposed to like raw aim and sort of loose freestyle players and run through smokes and just taking crazy pistol fights with people, etc. Because those sorts of battles that they lost in those major semis in CSGO, in 1.6, those are the matches they win. When they come in as the underdog, but they're given a really great match to the team that's their favourite, they just close those out and win most of those in 1.6. Like, people might not understand this. If this was 1.6, they'd have won that match against SK Gaming and Mirage in the semi-finals of ESL 1 Cologne 2016. And although SK Gaming was far and away the best team in the world and so complete because they were in position to win it, they would have beaten Fnatic, who at the time were about to win their back-to-back majors, their third overall in Cologne 2015. They'd have just crushed them after the second map, and Fnatic would be going home like Fnatic after the WCG 2009 final. Like, what the bloody hell happened? We were supposed to win that match. They were the classic underdogs who were super dangerous. When they were favourites, they were just okay. When they were underdogs, though, you better watch your ass, because they're going to take from your legacy the championship. You think you're just like walking up the red carpet to be coronated because you're the best team and you're even favourite against them, maybe even beat them last month at a smaller tournament. They just beat your ass there. They also won numerous tier 1 tournaments over an enormous span of time, again and again coming back to success. They had very few years where they didn't win a championship. 2010 was a famous notable one. They battled with, and even then they won some championships, they battled with and beat practically every top team since they'd arrived at Tier 1 in 2006, right up until basically the end. Like, let's say 2017, think of some of the teams they beat around that time. Because remember, they could even beat like SK Gaming, Astralis, etc., Fnatic. They had their time, guys. And it was an incredible time. It lasted a long time. So I'll just say at the end, for me, that whole angle, which people try to pin it on, that like TaZ getting that like BMW or Mercedes or whatever by the VP owner or CEO, like that was the angle that broke them up. I think that's really overblown. It's just how people cope with the fact that their favourite team couldn't, after doing a miracle of having all these years in CSGO staying with the same lineup, couldn't just do it for like 10 years, which it's already absurd they did it for like 5. Like, the idea they're going to do it for 10 is even more ridiculous to me. So maybe a topic for another video there. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Pronogo, Alexander Rao, Andreas Kroknes, ErikHillestad, Hades, JDubs, the Puyallup Tribe, Tobias Bernasconi, VatriSam, Xinged, James Pederson, and as always, a special thanks goes out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Do you want to ask a question in my monthly video AMA? Do you want teasers? See who the upcoming guests are going to be? Maybe you'd like to take part in one of those monthly donated discussions with me about esports. Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Screwluminati today in the Patreon link in the description box below.